Welcome back to the deep dive. We need to start today by acknowledging a feeling that I think everyone listening has had at least once in the last few years.
Yeah, a really familiar feeling.
Right. It's that specific kind of vertigo you get when you scroll through your news feed or you watch a press conference, and you suddenly realize that the person speaking isn't just leaving things out. They are inhabiting a completely different reality than you are.
It's the sensation of the ground just shifting beneath you, because we used to argue about opinions. I think taxes should be higher. You think they should be lower.
Exactly.
But now we are arguing about the fundamental architecture of reality.
We really are. And the question that keeps coming up is, are we just drowning in too much information? Or is something more structural happening? Is the news we consume an objective window into the world? Or is it a painting?
A painting.
Yeah, a curated, filtered, and varnished painting that basically hides the cracks in the wall behind it.
That distinction, the window versus the painting, that is the central tension of the information age. Because if it's a window, we just need to clean the glass.
Right.
But if it's a painting, we need to ask who the painter is and why did they choose those specific colors.
So to help us critique this painting, we are doing something a bit different today. We are breaking down a really intense, somewhat philosophical roundtable discussion from the Netherlands.
From a show called The New World. The New World.
Right. And this is not, a 3-minute cable news segment where people just shout talking points and they cut to a commercial.
No, not at all.
This is long-form, messy, intellectual combat. The host is a philosopher named Jel van Baardewijk, and he has gathered a triad of guests that perfectly represent the warring factions of our time.
We should really set the stage with these characters because they aren't just random guests, they are archetypes.
Let's do it.
First, you have the journalist, Weird Dick. He writes for De Telegraaf, which is a massive Dutch newspaper.
Right, think of him as the bad boy of the mainstream. He is inside the castle, he works for the legacy media, but he spends his time looking out the window at the peasants, trying to understand why they are angry. He's the insider who is genuinely uncomfortable with the consensus.
Then you have the activist, Eb Geetlink. Theater background, writer, alternative media figure.
The pure outsider.
Exactly. He has zero allegiance to the establishment. In fact, his entire career is basically built on poking it in the eye. He represents the alternative narrative, the view that the mainstream is fundamentally corrupt.
And finally, the entrepreneur, Wouter de Hey. He is an expert in nitrogen and industry.
He's the technocrat turned skeptic. He brings the scientific and industrial perspective to the table, but he's there to dismantle the idea that the science is this neutral god that must be blindly obeyed.
So we have the insider, the outsider, and the skeptic. And our mission today is to unpack their core argument. The argument that the mainstream media and the institutions behind it are gatekeepers.
We are going to look at how they manage the flow of truth and what actually happens when that management fails.
We have 3 big case studies to get through today. The war in Gaza, the conflict in Ukraine, and a very specific, very telling culture war happening right now in the Dutch countryside.
And I want to be super clear right up front. We aren't here to decide which of these guys is quote-unquote right about the wars or the nitrogen crisis. We are here to look at the mechanism of their disagreement.
Right. How do 2 highly intelligent people look at the exact same geographic location or event and see completely opposite things?
So let's start with that mechanism. The discussion opens with Weird Duke, the journalist, and he says something that honestly stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah, me too.
He's talking about the limitations of his job at a major mainstream newspaper, and he uses this phrase, money laundering.
It's a really jarring choice of words, isn't it?
It is. He says, I cannot money launder conspiracy theories into the mainstream news.
He gives the example of 9/11.
Right. He says even if there are theories out there that it was an inside job, he can't just print that as fact.
Let's unpack that metaphor, because it is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Money laundering is literally a crime. It is the process of taking dirty cash money from illegal sources and running it through a legitimate business so it comes out clean and usable in the banking system.
So in his analogy, the dirty cash is information from the alternative web.
Exactly. Information that hasn't been blessed by the proper authorities. Weird is admitting that there is a rigid border. On one side, you have the Wild West of the internet. Blogs, podcasts, Telegram channels.
And that information is dirty to the mainstream. It doesn't actually matter if it's true. It matters where it came from.
That is the kicker. He isn't saying, I can't print lies. He is saying, I can't print things that haven't been verified by the established institutions.
Right. If he prints a theory from the alternative web before the CIA or the government or a major wire service confirms it, he is guilty of laundering that information. He's giving it the stamp of authority, the clean bank account, that it doesn't deserve yet.
But doesn't that create a massive lag time? Or, honestly worse, a massive blind spot?
Yeah.
I mean, if the institutions are the ones lying, like, say, about weapons of mass destruction or the health of a world leader, then the journalist is structurally forbidden from reporting the truth until the liars themselves admit it.
Precisely. That is the trap. And Weird describes this friction so vividly, the alternative crowd screams at him, "Why aren't you reporting this? It's obvious."
He replies, "Because I can't just take your word for it."
But then the mainstream crowd screams at him for even acknowledging that the alternative theory exists in the first place.
He says he can write, "There are theories that X happened," but he can't write, "X happened."
And to the average reader, that distinction feels like weaseling. It feels like the media is just hedging its bets. But Weird is arguing it's a necessary firewall to keep total insanity out of the paper.
The problem, of course, is that the firewall often keeps out inconvenient truths, right along with the insanity.
Which leads right into the good faith argument. The host, Gel, tries to be the peacemaker here. He says, come on, most journalists and politicians are acting in good faith. They aren't evil. They aren't waking up thinking, how can I trick the population today?
Which is a very comforting thought. We desperately want to believe our leaders are at least trying to be honest.
But Ab, the activist, isn't buying it. And this is where we get to the core concept of the whole discussion. The paradigm.
Yes. Ab actively challenges the good faith idea. He argues that it literally doesn't matter if they are lying consciously. The problem is that their ideology, their paradigm, comes before the facts.
Hold on, let's drill down on that. Ideology comes before facts. I think most people believe it works the other way around.
Right. You see a fact, and then you form an opinion.
That is the scientific ideal. But Ab is arguing that in the current media landscape, the paradigm is a literal filter. Imagine you are wearing blue-tinted glasses. You cannot see the color red.
It's not that you are choosing to ignore red things. It's that your biological apparatus for perceiving reality literally filters them out.
So if a journalist operates in a Western liberal paradigm, and a fact comes along that directly contradicts that paradigm,
it doesn't get processed. It just gets categorized as noise or disinformation or totally irrelevant.
it's not a lie, it's a blind spot.
It is an active rejection. The brain works incredibly hard to maintain consistency. If you believe your government is the good guy and you see evidence of a war crime, your brain will do crazy mental gymnastics to frame it as a mistake or collateral damage, rather than an act of evil.
You aren't lying to your readers. You are lying to yourself first.
And this isn't theoretical. The source material moves immediately to a brutal, real-world example of this paradigm clash: the war in Gaza.
This section of the transcript is so tense you can practically feel the air leave the room.
Because they aren't just disagreeing on a policy proposal, they're disagreeing on actual history.
Let's look at Weird's paradigm first. He represents the security paradigm. What is the starting point of his reality?
His starting point is existential threat. He explicitly talks about Israel as the sanctuary for Jews post-Auschwitz. The maxim is never again.
So in his paradigm, the clock essentially resets every time there is a threat to Jewish survival. When he looks at October 7th, he sees a pogrom. He sees an attempt to erase the sanctuary.
And if that is your starting point, the logic follows pretty strictly. If someone tries to erase you, you have to destroy them. He argues that Hamas must be destroyed and that a two-state solution is currently dead.
Right. He is a hardcore realist here. He says, look at the map. Look at the violence. The only language that works in this specific region is force. He even points out that Arab nations are normalizing relations with Israel because they want stability, not the endless chaos of the Palestinian cause.
So that is paradigm A: security, survival, force. Then Ab speaks up. And he lives in paradigm B.
Paradigm B is human rights and colonial history. His clock absolutely doesn't start on October 7th. It starts in 1948 or even earlier.
Right, he talks about the Nakba, the catastrophe, the displacement of Palestinians during the founding of Israel.
And he brings in a very specific, very personal experience. He talks about driving through the West Bank. He says, I have a Western passport. I wave at the soldier and I drive right through the checkpoint. The Palestinian behind me waits for 4 hours.
To him, that systemic inequality is a fundamental fact. It's an apartheid system.
Exactly. Now, here is where the gatekeeper clash really explodes because Abba views the situation as a 75-year oppression. He uses a very specific word to describe Hamas. He calls them a resistance movement.
And weird just explodes.
Viscerally, he completely cuts him off. He calls them a psychopathic terror gang. He lists the atrocities, the babies, the hostages, the rapes.
But wait, let's pause here. This is the money laundering thing again, isn't it? Too weird. Calling Hamas a resistance movement is laundering terrorism. It is giving legitimacy to psychopaths.
And to calling them only terrorists is laundering the occupation. It is erasing the history that produced the violence in the first place. If you only say terrorist, you imply they kill because they are just inherently evil, not because they are fighting for land.
It is pure linguistic warfare. Terrorist versus freedom fighter. Security versus apartheid. They are using the same alphabet, but they're speaking entirely different languages.
And the really scary part for the listener is that there is basically no middle ground here. You can't really compromise between they are psychopaths who must be destroyed and they are a resistance movement fighting oppression. The paradigms are mutually exclusive.
So we hit a total deadlock on Gaza. But the source moves on to Ukraine, and I think this part was even more illuminating because it actually offered a structured way to look at the confusion.
Yeah.
Ab introduces this three wars theory.
I found this incredibly helpful because usually the news gives us a very simple binary. Invader, which is Russia, versus defender, which is Ukraine, good versus bad.
Super simple. Marvel movie stuff.
Ab says, no, look closer. There are actually 3 wars happening on top of each other, kind of like layers of a cake.
Okay, what's layer 1?
The Civil War. This is the internal conflict within Ukraine, specifically the Donbas region. The struggle between the Russian-speaking population and the Ukrainian-speaking nationalist movement. This started way before the 2022 invasion.
And this is the layer the West really likes to ignore, right?
Yeah.
Because if it is a civil war, then it gets messy. It is not just a straightforward foreign invasion. It is a country tearing itself apart.
Exactly. Acknowledging layer 1 muddies the moral waters. Then you have layer 2. The sovereignty war. This is the Russian invasion, Putin crossing the border. And this is the layer the mainstream media focuses on 100% of the time because it is clear-cut illegality.
And layer 3.
The proxy war. NATO and the U.S. versus Russia. Ukraine is the physical battlefield, but the larger strategic goal is weakening Russia.
This is the cynical layer. This is where we send weapons not just to save Ukraine, but to bleed Putin.
Ab's argument is that the mainstream gatekeepers only allow us to talk about layer 2. If you dare to talk about layer 1, the Civil War, you are immediately accused of being a Putin apologist.
Right.
And if you talk about layer 3, the proxy war, you are accused of being anti-American.
So the truth is artificially constrained to the middle layer.
Which leads to a totally distorted reality. They discuss the figure of Zelensky. In the Western paradigm, he is a pure hero. He's Churchill in a t-shirt.
But the panel actually challenges this. They talk about heroism versus tragedy.
This is a profound distinction. A hero fights to the bitter end. A hero sacrifices everything for ultimate victory. But Ab asks, is that actually good for the people? Or is it a tragedy?
Because the tangible result of that heroism is hundreds of thousands of dead men and a completely destroyed infrastructure.
Right. They argue that by constantly fueling the hero narrative, the West is actually enabling the destruction of Ukraine.
Because if we focused on the tragedy narrative, we would be pushing for negotiations. We would be trying to stop the bleeding.
But heroes don't negotiate. Heroes fight until they win or die.
Interestingly, Weird, who, remember, is the mainstream journalist here, he actually agrees with a lot of this critique. He explicitly calls the West's role dumb and even malicious.
He really does. He points out that for decades, Russia warned the West. They said, don't expand NATO to our border. It is a red line. And the West basically said, we don't care about your red lines. Weird argues we poked the bear, and now we are acting completely shocked that the bear swiped back.
But he still draws a firm line, doesn't he? He says, you can explain why Putin invaded, but you absolutely cannot excuse it.
Yes. He refuses to cross the line into saying Putin is right. He just says the West was incredibly stupid. But then they bring up this fascinating image of the marionette, the puppet.
They mention Mark Rutte, the Dutch prime minister who is now heading to NATO. They literally call him a marionette.
This is a crucial point. They aren't saying Rutte is a literal puppet of some secret cabal meeting in a dark room. They are saying he is a puppet of the logic of escalation.
The logic of the machine itself.
Exactly. Once the war starts, the institutional logic says we must win. We cannot lose face, send more weapons. The leader basically stops making independent choices, and just follows the path of least resistance within the system.
They are sleepwalking into World War III. Not because they actually want to, but because the system they built literally doesn't have a reverse gear.
That is the gatekeeper of the institution. It filters out the option of peace because peace looks like weakness.
That is a terrifying thought, that
Yeah.
there is no pilot, just an autopilot set to escalate. Okay, so we have looked at the media gatekeeper with the money laundering concept and the geopolitical gatekeeper with the war narratives. Now we need to shift gears. We are leaving the battlefield and entering the laboratory because surely science is immune to this. Science is just raw data, right?
You would certainly hope so. But Wu Zhihe, the entrepreneur and nitrogen expert, is about to completely shatter that illusion.
For our international listeners, we need to very quickly explain the nitrogen crisis. It sounds like a bizarre sci-fi plot, but it is a very real, very intense thing in the Netherlands.
It is. The short version is this. The Netherlands has incredibly intensive agriculture. Lots of cows, pigs, fertilizer. And this produces massive nitrogen emissions.
Right.
The EU has very strict rules about protecting nature areas from nitrogen. A Dutch court ruled the Netherlands was violating these rules. So suddenly, overnight, basically, the government had to tell thousands of farmers, you need to cut your herds or completely shut down your multi-generational business.
Which predictably caused massive protests. Tractors blocking major highways, burning hay bales. It became a huge culture war.
Farmers versus the state. Rural versus urban.
And Buder enters this not as a farmer, but as a guy who deeply understands the industry and the chemistry. And he critiques the actual science behind these government rules. He talks about the monoculture of the mind.
He uses a really great analogy from his university days. He says back in the day at Delft University, the culture was intellectual combat. You would debate fiercely, you would tear each other's arguments completely apart, and then you'd go drink a beer together.
The beer test. If you can't have a beer afterwards, the debate wasn't healthy.
Right. But he says today, the universities and the research institutes like TNO in the Netherlands have become complete monocultures. Everyone thinks exactly the same. Everyone reads the same papers like NRC and De Volkskrant. Everyone votes for the same progressive parties.
So there is absolutely no friction. There is no one in the room to say, hey, wait a minute. Is this computer model actually correct?
And it is not just peer pressure, it's the funding trap. We really need to spend a minute on this because it explains so much of modern science.
How does the trap actually work?
Well, imagine you are a researcher. You need money to run your lab and pay your staff. Who has the money?
Right.
Government. Now, the government has a stated policy. We need to reduce nitrogen to save nature.
Okay. Makes sense so far.
So they put out a grant, 1 million euros for research on how nitrogen damages nature.
I see where this is going.
If you write a proposal saying, I want to study why nitrogen might not be the primary problem, do you think you get that €1,000,000?
Probably not.
You definitely don't. So the financial incentive structure ensures that all the science produced aligns perfectly with the government's pre-existing policy. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government pays for science that proves the government is right.
So the gatekeeper here isn't a censor with a black marker. It is the grand administrator.
Exactly. And Wooter goes even deeper. He suggests that for many of these ecologists, this isn't just a 9-to-5 job. It is a religion.
A religion.
He argues that saving the planet acts as a moral imperative that completely supersedes scientific objectivity. If you truly believe the Earth is dying and you believe nitrogen is the poison killing it, then finding data that minimizes the nitrogen problem feels, well, it feels sinful. It feels like you are betraying the righteous cause.
So the truth literally becomes secondary to the mission.
We call this noble cause corruption. You bend the rules slightly or you cherry pick the data that fits because you believe the end result, saving nature, is so universally important that it justifies the scientific shortcut.
He talks about a thick blanket of consensus.
Yes. The politicians go on TV and say, we are just following the science. And the scientists say, we are just doing the research funded by the politicians. It is a perfectly closed loop, a fortress. And if you are an outsider like a farmer or a skeptic like Wooter, you cannot break in.
Speaking of outsiders trying to break in, this brings us to what I thought was the most personal, revealing story of the entire episode, the story of Femke Wiersma.
This is where the abstract academic concept of gatekeeping becomes very human and very nasty.
So who is Femke Wiersma?
She is a minister in the Dutch government for the BBB party, the Farmer Citizen Movement. This is the populist party that essentially rose up out of those massive tractor protests.
But she's not your typical lifelong politician.
No, not at all. She didn't study political science at Leiden University. She wasn't groomed in the youth wing of a major political party. She was actually a participant on a reality TV show called Boer Zoekt Vrouw. Farmer Wants a Wife.
She was literally a reality TV star.
She was. She's young, she's female, she's attractive, and she speaks the plain language of the common people, not the sanitized jargon of the technocrats.
And the establishment absolutely hated her for it. The source material discusses a hit piece written about her in a major, respected newspaper.
It was a brutal article. And what did they focus on? Did they critique her policy, her budget proposals?
No, they focused on her shoes.
Her high heels. They explicitly contrasted her high heels with the quote-unquote sensible loafers of the serious bureaucrats in The Hague.
It sounds like a Mean Girls scene from a high school movie.
It really does. The panel analyzes this as pure classism. The high heels were a symbol. The media was essentially saying, you are vain, you are superficial, you are low culture, you simply do not belong in the serious halls of power.
It is the immune system of the state attacking a foreign virus.
That is the perfect metaphor. And Wuda suggests that it wasn't just the media acting alone. He strongly implies that the civil servants within her own ministry, the permanent bureaucracy, were actively leaking things to the press to undermine her on purpose.
Because she represents a direct threat to their monoculture.
Exactly. She is the alien. She doesn't share their paradigm. She doesn't go to their dinner parties. She doesn't agree with their nitrogen theology. So they have to expel her.
It really shows that gatekeeping isn't just about controlling information. It is about controlling people. It's about maintaining a rigid caste system where the experts rule and the populace is just supposed to listen.
And when the populace sends a representative who refuses to just listen, the experts panic. They use every tool they have. Mockery, strategic leaks, media attacks, just to destroy her credibility.
So we have painted a pretty bleak picture here today. The media launders the truth. Geopolitics is locked in a runaway war narrative. Science is a funded monoculture. And the bureaucracy is an exclusive club that hazes any newcomers.
It certainly sounds like the gates are totally unbreakable.
But the episode ends with a bit of a twist. A tremor in the force, as Weird Dick puts it.
Yes, the crumbling gates.
Weird freely admits that the power of the mainstream media is dying.
He sees the internal numbers. People are actively leaving the newspapers. They are turning off the evening TV news. And where are they going?
They're going to podcasts, to YouTube, to independent shows like The New World. Or, shows like The Deep Dive.
Exactly. And why? Because people smell the money laundering. They sense that the main narrative is too clean, too filtered. They want the raw feed. They want the messy reality.
He mentions Barry Weiss as the prime example of this shift.
Right. She was a star writer for the New York Times, and she felt the paradigm closing in on her. The strict orthodoxy, the complete inability to discuss certain controversial topics, so she just quit.
Which in journalism usually means absolute career suicide.
Usually, yes. But she started the Free Press. And it exploded. It became a massive, highly profitable success. She took the audience right with her.
Which proves that the gatekeepers no longer physically own the audience.
The audience has found a hole in the fence. Weird also mentions Donald Trump in this specific context.
Buzz.
He notes that while European mainstream media mostly treats Trump as just a clown, a pure, inexplicable anomaly, American security analysts and alternative media are actually looking deeply at why he is so popular. They are discussing the massive failures of the neoliberal order. The mainstream completely ignores these deep currents because they are uncomfortable, but the alternative media dives right in.
So the information gate is genuinely falling.
It is. But, and here's the final, very sobering warning from the panel.
There is always a but.
The institutional gate is still standing very, very strong.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you can listen to whatever podcast you want. You can watch The New World on YouTube and nod your head in agreement. But who actually writes the laws? Who distributes the multi-million-euro nitrogen grants? Who decides if we send fighter jets to Ukraine?
The bureaucracy, the NGOs, the legacy universities.
Woder points out that these institutions are funded by billions of euros. They have hard legal power. They have decades of momentum. You might have won the battle for the narrative on social media, but they still own the battle for reality in the courtroom and the parliament.
So the fight has essentially just moved It used to be about who owned the printing press. Now it is about who owns the institutions.
That is the new front line. And that battle is going to be much, much harder to win.
So let's try to bring this all home for the listener. We have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We've traveled from the philosophical definition of truth straight through the blood and mud of war, all the way to the high society gatekeeping of The Hague.
And the core message seems to be that we're living in an era of clashing paradigms.
It's not about simple lies. It's not just that the news is fake. It's that the news is a product of a very specific worldview that is increasingly disconnected from the daily reality of normal people.
The new world that the source material talks about. It's a world where the old authorities have completely lost our trust, but new authorities haven't fully replaced them yet.
We are in the interregnum, the messy time between worlds. And historically, that is a very dangerous place to be.
Because if the mainstream media loses total control, who takes over?
That is the ultimate risk. As the gates crumble, do we actually get the truth? Or do we just splinter into 1,000 tiny tribes that hate each other?
Right. If I exclusively listen to my podcast that tells me nitrogen is a complete hoax, and you only read your paper that tells you nitrogen is the literal apocalypse, can we even be neighbors anymore?
That is the exact tragedy Wooter and Weird are pointing to. The monoculture of the elite alienates the public. But the total fragmentation of the alternative media alienates us from each other.
So here's the final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. We've spent this entire hour critiquing the gatekeepers, the journalist who launders the news, the bureaucrat who ruthlessly protects the system, the scientist who just follows the grant money.
But if all those gates are falling, who is guarding your mind right now?
That is the question. Because it is so easy to say, I don't trust the mainstream. But are you actually doing the hard work of seeking truth? Or are you just finding a new gatekeeper, a favorite YouTuber, a podcaster, an influencer who just tells you exactly what you want to hear?
Or are you actually breaking out of the paradigm, or are you just buying a different pair of tinted glasses?
The source heavily suggests that in a world without gatekeepers, the terrifying responsibility for truth falls entirely on you. And frankly, that is an exhausting amount of work.
It is. But the alternative is being a marionette.
And I don't think anyone waking up today wants to be a puppet.
Definitely not.
Wait, I want to circle back to one tiny thing before we glossed over a bit. But Woder mentioned the religious aspect of science. And I think that is the secret key to this whole self-gatekeeping idea.
You mean the idea that the moral mission totally overrides the hard data?
Yes.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you truly believe you are saving the world, accuracy starts to feel like a luxury.
It is classic consequentialism. The ends justify the means. If fudging the data slightly saves the planet, then fudging the data isn't fraud, it's a moral act.
That is just terrifying, because it means you can't trust the data specifically because the scientist is trying to be a good person.
And that is exactly why the clash of paradigms is so incredibly vicious right now. We aren't arguing about dry facts. We are arguing about theology. We are arguing about what is sacred. To the farmer, the generational farm is sacred. To the ecologist, the untouched nature reserve is sacred. You simply cannot compromise on the sacred.
And to the legacy journalist, the consensus is sacred.
Exactly.
Okay, now my brain officially hurts.
Good. That means the deep dive actually worked today.
I think so too. Thank you for listening, everyone. This was a really heavy one, but I think a vitally important one.
Absolutely. Keep questioning the painting. Always look for the window.
See you next time.